Parts of Rishi Sunak's £15 billion cost of living package are targeted at the poorest. For example, you'll be entitled to more cash if you're on means-tested benefits. But other parts of the offer are universal, and all households, however well off, will get £400 off their bills. Rishi Sunak was challenged about these untargeted parts of his plan on the BBC.
Does it feel right to you that someone, say, in your financial position, receives a £400 grant, or someone with a second home receives two lots of £400 grants?
As I said, second homes account for, I think, 1 or 2% of the property stock.
It's not the point, though, is it? The point is that the wealthy who don't need the grant are receiving the grant. Does that feel right to you?
The point is, when you're trying to make policy that benefits tens of millions of people, there are only a couple of practical ways that you can do that. Now, in an ideal, perfect, theoretical world, what you're saying is, of course, right. But we have to deal with practical reality of actually delivering policy and delivering support to tens of millions of people. And there aren't that many ways you can do it. We've talked about the two main ways. One is council tax system. One is through energy bills on a more universal basis. And as I said, we've picked one, and it would be reasonable for you to ask your questions. And if we pick the other, I'm 100% sure we'd be spending all this time talking about deserving people who would feel that they had missed out. And then we'd had plenty of case studies of those. And I wanted to make sure that they were all covered. And that's why we've gone for the way that we have.
Now, I don't usually say this, but I have to admit, this is one of the few issues where I'm on Rishi Sunak's side. Universalist policies are often criticised for helping the wealthy, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. The broader a policy applies, the broader the levels of support it can achieve. Think of the NHS, for example. Because rich and poor people use it, there aren't very many calls to get rid of it. When you have something that's just relied on by poor people, it often has weaker support and therefore is more vulnerable. Rishi Sunak is also right that when you means test something, there will always be people who need the benefit who get left out. And to my mind, it's better to include some people who don't need the help than exclude others who do. But this is not to say I've converted to Team Rishi Sunak. And that's because the BBC and media have been challenging Sunak on completely the wrong questions. By focusing on the red herring of this £400, they're missing the wood from the trees. And it's because they're steeped, yes, in neoliberal ideology. That's relevant here because neoliberalism encourages people to scrutinise how the state distributes money, but to completely ignore how the market distributes wealth. And it's that ideology which means the press will grill the Chancellor about giving £400 to wealthy families, which to me is a perfectly acceptable byproduct of a necessary universal policy, but overlook the actual outrages he's responsible for. Let's take a couple of data points as examples. First, according to the ONS, between January 2021 and January 2022, house prices increased by 9.6%. And the Financial Times report that total growth in house prices from January 2020 to January 2022 was a whopping 18%. That means the average house costs £40,000 more than it did 2 years ago. And what this means is that the average homeowner has become £40,000 richer in 2 years. And that's not the result of hard work. Indeed, you could say it's money for nothing. And to my mind, it's certainly a much bigger outrage than any £400 that any wealthy person might receive to pay their energy bills. Our second set of data points comes from an Oxfam report on how the super rich benefited from the pandemic. Using data from Forbes, they say there are 2,668 billionaires in the world, 573 more than in 2020 when the pandemic began. These billionaires are collectively worth $12.7 trillion, a real terms increase of $3.78 trillion, or 42% during the COVID pandemic. And they say total billionaire wealth is now the equivalent of 13.9% of gross domestic product, up from 4.4% in 2000. And the richest 10 men have greater wealth than the poorest 40% of humanity combined. Let's focus on that second point about the growth of billionaire wealth. Oxfam say it's grown by $3.78 trillion over the pandemic. Divided by the number of billionaires they state, that makes $1.3 billion each for the average billionaire. So in the last 2 years, the average billionaire got over an extra $1 billion. Again, that strikes me as a much bigger deal than some families getting £400 they don't need. Yet we talk about and pretend to be outraged about the £400 that go to some wealthy people because of a necessary universal policy. But we say nothing, we hear nothing about the £40,000 average, which has gone to homeowners over the past 2 years for doing nothing. And by the way, has meant that rents have gone up and it's harder for anyone else to get on the property ladder. And we don't talk about the billionaires who've become £1 billion richer, because that's invisible, that's seen as natural. Ash, make it make sense for me.
I can't make it make sense for you, Michael, but I can add to your ire. So when you're looking at the inflation of billionaire wealth over the pandemic, that's just the money which is visible. So according to Oliver Bullock and his theory on Moneyland, anything between 1 in 4 and 1 in 7 of all dollars in circulation is actually in Moneyland, this kind of shadowy realm of hiding assets so that they don't appear really on any government's books. You use lots of opaque means like shell companies, very hard to access ways of finding out who owns what. And so you've got the asset, but the taxman can't see it and you can still access the wealth from it. I think Moose has just come in to join the conversation. So in terms of the appreciation of asset wealth over the course of the pandemic, that's just what we can see. When it comes to the BBC's coverage of means testing, it shows how steeped they are in that ideology of the deserving and the undeserving, the idea that universal services are bad, that they're inefficient. Whereas, as you said, when you look at something like the NHS, universal services are actually a very efficient way of distributing state resources, because you're not wasting all this time trying to police who's able to access it. You just make the service as good as it possibly can be. But I don't actually think that that's why Rishi Sunak and the government have decided not to means test this one-off payment. I think the reason why is because if you talk to any Conservative MP, consumer behaviour has already changed a lot. And we're just at the beginning of this cost of living crisis, and consumer behaviour has changed across the board. And that means that Conservative voters, who tend to be homeowners, who tend to be more economically secure than other people in society, such as renters, social housing tenants, people who are precariously employed, underemployed or unemployed, they are feeling the pinch of energy bills. So I would be in full agreement that not means testing is the right thing to do. That's definitely the right way to go. But the reason why they're doing it is because they know that this cost of living crisis, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's a great leveler, but it is going to impact the pockets of people who generally weren't that poorly affected by things like austerity or the financial crisis in 2008. So there's always time for means testing when something only affects the poor. Suddenly it becomes a waste of time and resources when the better off are being affected as well.
The most outrageous one is that if you have 2 homes, because the discount is done by household, which fair enough. Energy bills are also done by household, but if you own 2 homes, you get two full discounts. One thing I maybe want to push back on slightly, Ash, is this idea of the deserving and the undeserving, because we've often fought it in the context of state benefits, in the context of austerity, trying to divide people between people who are the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. But I do think that when it comes to the economy, some people are undeserving. If you are £40,000 richer because you were lucky enough to own a home, or if you live in London, for example, and probably you're at the top end of how much your house is worth, maybe the value of your house has gone up 80 grand, right? No moral judgment about you as a person, but you don't deserve that wealth. You didn't do anything for it.
I think the way in which you deal with that is by dealing with the tax system at the other end. So rather than investing loads in means testing, which I think will almost always disproportionately impact people who are at the lower end of better off, rather than actually making sure that rich people don't get things they deserve. Rich people get things they don't deserve all the time, like tax breaks, like favourable rates of capital gains tax compared to income tax, like
the rent I pay every month.
Like the rent you pay every month. The rich get things they don't deserve all the time. But if you had a well-designed taxation system, for instance, when it comes to this £400 payment, you can get that back on the other side if you adjust the top rate of tax. But Rishi Sunak doesn't want to do that.
He doesn't want to do that. And he doesn't want to expropriate everyone's second homes and implement rent controls, which is why we need to get rid of this man. All of us here at Novara Media are working harder than ever to keep scrutinising establishment politicians and the media barons who protect them. We don't have billionaire funders. We don't have advertising partnerships. We're funded entirely by you. If you've ever thought about supporting us, now's the time to go to novaramedia.com/support and donate anything you can from just £1 per month. Defy the corporate media, join our monthly supporters and help build our supporter base to 10,000 strong.